Okay, great. Looks like we have our participants, and thank you for coming to our panel here. Thank you for the Historical Commission for including us. My name is Peter Mickulas. I am the executive editor for history and sociology, specifically regional history at Rutgers University Press in New Brunswick. And I am very privileged to have gathered together several of my authors, of whom I'm very proud to be working with. Jean Soderlund, Camille Townsend, and Nicky Michael are all working on different books. Well, Camille and Nicky are working together. And I wanted to introduce each of them to you as they begin their papers. So I'll start with Jean in order of presentation. Jean R. Soderlund is a professor of history emeritus at Lehigh University over in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She is the author of Lenape Country, Delaware Valley Society before William Penn, and the forthcoming, and this is our book, very exciting, Separate Paths, Lenapes and Colonists in West New Jersey. And I am excited to say that she will be able to share for the first time to the general public a picture, an image of her book cover. So I would like to turn it over to Jean if she is ready. Hi, Jean.
Hi. I'm looking for the slideshow. Oh, well. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the nice introduction, Peter. And I've been looking forward to this talk very much. And I want to start by saying historians have pursued a number of methods to learn about the religious beliefs of the Lenape people when the Dutch, Swedes, and English arrived in the Delaware Valley. My talk uses one method, reading the documents that European missionaries and government officials produced in the 17th and early 18th centuries for information about how the Lenapes responded to colonization in ways that reflected their spiritual ideals. Lenape communities endured devastating epidemics and loss of territory to colonizers during that period, as smallpox and other European diseases destroyed families and towns. Few Lenapes adopted Christianity before the 1740s, when Moravian and Presbyterian clergymen convinced some people to convert. The Lenape homeland stretches from what is now southern New York through eastern Pennsylvania and northern Delaware, and through all of New Jersey. The Lenapes who controlled the region approximately north of Trenton spoke the Muncie dialect. Okay, so this is the new cover of my book. My book, Separate Paths, Lenapes and Colonists in West New Jersey, which will be published in July by Rutgers University Press, focuses on relations between the Lenapes and Europeans in the lower Delaware Valley, the homeland of the Lenapes, who spoke Lenape. The Muncies and Lenapes affiliated closely, had similar cultures, and lived in autonomous towns. Okay. The Lenape communities that interacted most frequently with West Jersey colonists included the Cohansicks, Narraticons, Armawamis, Mantees, and Rancocas. As the Lenapes resisted Christianization, their sovereignty included government and ownership of land. They maintained control of the lower Delaware Valley through most of the 17th century. Lenapes did not leave written records from that time period, but they did interact with Europeans who sometimes recorded their actions and words. The problems with using early European documents to learn about Lenape religion are considerable. most importantly because of the biases of European colonizers. And in my case, I have to admit, my own limitations arising from a Christian education. In addition, Lenapes concealed much of their theology from the Europeans who misrepresented it in an effort to promote Christianity and colonization. Dutch and Swedish missionaries focused to a large extent on the distinctions they could perceive between Lenape religion and Christianity, exaggerating differences to characterize Lenape beliefs as devil worship. Nevertheless, we can see in the European accounts 3 ways in which Lenapes responded to colonization that reflected the strength of their religious beliefs. First, they protected their children and communities from forced conversion and captivity. They insisted on religious freedom and refused to adopt Christianity, and they interpreted epidemics and loss of territory as evidence of God's anger for permitting the Europeans to colonize their land. In 1628, for example, the Dutch Reformed minister Eunice Bacone protested that the natives used the Lenape pidgin rather than teaching the Europeans their more sophisticated language. He complained that the pidgin was inadequate to convey religious matters. He noted that the Lenapes did this by design, to conceal their language from us rather than to properly communicate it, except in things which happen in daily trade. In restricting conversations to commerce rather than religion and culture, Lenape parents hoped to protect their children from the grasp of Christian missionaries. Mickulas wanted to separate the children from their families, to teach them the Dutch language and religion, and to give them, quote, good examples of virtuous living, unquote. He reported, however, that, quote, this separation is hard to effect, for the parents have a strong affection for their children and are very loath to part with them. And when they are separated from them, as we have already proved, the parents are never contented, but take them away stealthily or induce them to run away, unquote. Johan Prince, the governor of New Sweden in 1643, also reported to his superiors the challenge of converting Lenapes to Christianity. He wrote, quote, they serve Satan with their kintika, religious dances, and sacrifice to him, that he may give them success in their hunts and that he may do them no harm. And when we speak to them about God, they pay no attention, but they will let it be understood that they are a free people, subject to no one, but do what they please. Sweden sent several ministers to the Delaware Valley to serve as pastors for the colonists and convert Lenapes. More than other Swedish Lutheran priests, Johan Campanius tried to convert the Lenapes to Christianity by translating its concepts into the Lenape pidgin. In a report, he explained that the Lenapes were at first suspicious of Lutheran worship, in which the minister stood alone and talked so long while all the rest were listening in silence. Though a few Lenapes indicated interest, Campanius failed to convert any natives. The Lenapes remained dominant in the Delaware Valley, protecting their religious beliefs and freedom. The Dutch, Swedes, and other Europeans brought disease along with missionaries and desire for land. They carried smallpox, influenza, and measles, for which Lenapes lacked immunity. In the lower Delaware Valley, the Lenape population declined to approximately 8,000 by the mid-1630s and to an estimated 3,000 by 1670, when the Europeans on both sides of the Delaware numbered only about 858. As elsewhere in North America, the waves of disease disrupted Lenape families and towns forcing communities to merge. In 1654, for example, an epidemic swept through Lenape communities soon after the new governor of New Sweden, Johan Rising, and 250 colonists arrived. About 100 immigrants had died on board, and more died after they landed. At a conference with Lenape leaders, Rising unsuccessfully tried to convince them that the ship had not brought any evil, which was to destroy them. Rising noted that the Lenapes feared that all of their people would perish. He responded that they should turn to God, who would help the Swedes and could also help them to improve if they had confidence in him. In Peter Lindeström's narrative, the Lenapes expressed no interest in the Swedes' God. One of the Lenapes requested a boat to travel to Cape Henlopen to beg, quote, Tentaken, a great sachem, to take away the bad Manitou, that is the evil one, whom he sent in our ship and all around the ship, otherwise both we and all would die, unquote. When the Swedes asked what evil they had seen, the Lenape said, like fire all around the ship. The English takeover of the European colony on the Delaware in 1664 worsened relations in the Delaware Valley, as the Duke of York's government took Lenape territory without sufficient treaty negotiations. By 1670, Lenapes had killed 10 Europeans who encroached on their homeland. At least some of the slayings reflected the Lenapes' form of mourning war, as they connected epidemics, English greed for land, and God's displeasure for permitting colonization. In conducting mourning war, the Lenapes killed but did not capture or ritually torture Europeans in reprisal for deaths of family members from disease and murders by colonists. European negotiators and Lenapes met in September 1670 at the Lenape town Onionikin in Burlington, in what is now Burlington County, in West Jersey, where they were celebrating a harvest festival with what the colonists called a cantico. A year later, in September 1671, the English government in New York received news that 2 Dutch servants had been killed on Matinicum Island, now Burlington Island. The Lenapes told the English that Tashiawai had killed them because his sister had died from illness, and expressing, quote, great grief for it, and said, the Manitou hath killed my sister, and I will go and kill the Christians, unquote. The full meaning of Tashiawai statement is unclear, though his invocation of the Manitou suggests that he believed that the spirit had killed his sister because the Lenapes had allowed the Europeans to settle on Lenape land. This was similar to the conference in 1654, when Lenapes had linked European diseases with a bad Manitou, whom God had sent against them. With the arrival of English Quakers to found West New Jersey and Pennsylvania after 1675, the Lenapes of the Delaware Valley sustained continuing epidemics and lost more and more land. By 1737, the Lenapes in West Jersey lived primarily in communities on the upper reaches of streams. In that year, the Pennsylvania government cheated the Lenapes out of their remaining territory on the Delaware River through what is known as the walking purchase. During the so-called walk of 1.5 days, the runners spent the night in the forest near the town of Lapawinsa and other Lenapes at Hockandaqua, far to the north of Tohickon Creek, where the Lenapes expected the walk to end. The runners complained that the Lenapes refused them entrance to the town and that the quote unquote shouting during a religious ceremony kept them awake. the runners covered much more territory than the Lenapes expected. The Lenapes expected that the upper boundary of the walking purchase would be Tohickon Creek, so that this area would have been ceded to the colonists. Instead, the runners, rather than walkers, completed 64 miles to a point near Jim Thorpe in 18 hours. The Pennsylvania official, James Logan, drew the boundary there, extending the line northeast in a way that would give the colonists more than 1,100 square miles. In the mid-18th century, several Lenape prophets preached that God was punishing the Lenapes through disease, loss of land, and poor hunting because of their collusion with Europeans. In 1751, a few years prior to the 7 Years' War, a Lenape woman, whose name is unknown, told the people of Wyoming here on the Susquehanna River that it was the mind of the great power that they should destroy the poison from among them. The Lenapes interpreted her message to mean that they should remain separate from the British, reject Christianity, and resist expropriation of their land. Indeed, they told the Presbyterian John Brainerd, who traveled from the Bethel Mission near Cranbury, New Jersey, that they would not meet as a group to hear his Christian message. They told him that, quote, the white people were contriving a method to deprive them of their country, and they had done as they had done by the seaside, and to make slaves of them and their children, unquote. While the Wyoming Lenapes denied Brainerd permission to preach, they indicated that the Presbyterian Lenapes in New Jersey, but not their minister, were welcome to come live with them on the Susquehanna and have liberty to worship God as they thought right. When the interpreter said that the Presbyterian Lenapes would only migrate with Brainerd, the Wyoming Lenapes replied, quote, the minister must not come because he was a white man, that if one white man came, another would desire it, etc. And so by and by, they should lose their country, unquote. A decade later, in the 1760s, the Lenape shaman Nealon helped to create the religious movement leading to Pontiac's War through his message that natives had declined from disease and theft of land because they had tolerated settlement by Europeans and adopted their ways. The Lenapes concealed many elements of their religion from Europeans. We can learn from the documents how they resisted Christianity and colonization during the 17th and early 18th centuries. In response to missionaries and colonists, the Lenapes clarified their efforts to protect their children and communities from forced conversion and captivity, their insistence on religious freedom, and their linkage of God's anger, epidemics of European disease, and loss of land through colonization. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jean. Next up on our panel is Camilla Townsend, who is a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And she is the author of The Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs, which was awarded the Cundill Prize. And she is also the co-author with Nicky Michael of the forthcoming book in Rutgers Press called On the Turtle's Back, Stories the Lenape Told Their Grandchildren. And I'm excited to introduce Camille Townsend.
Hello all, it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. As Peter has just explained, I am working on a book with Nicky Michaels, and I am speaking in between Jean Soderlund and Nicky Michaels because what I will cover literally chronologically is rather a sort of a bridge between what the two of them have talked about and will talk about. So let me get down to it. I'm going to share my screen, if you will bear with me a moment. Okay. Ah, now I see what. There we go. Okay. So I approached the study of the Lenape from a rather different angle. Peter mentioned a few minutes ago that one of my recent books was called Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs. And indeed, I have spent most of the last 20 years studying the Aztec language and Aztec history, not Lenape language and history. But a number of years ago, actually in 2016, we can date this, Rutgers University approached Deborah Gray White of my department, history, and asked her to launch the multiple studies of the disenfranchisement of African American and Native American peoples that had occurred in the colonial era in New Jersey at the time that Rutgers was founded. So she came to me and asked me to help her prepare a segment of the book that she was already planning. And my segment would, of course, encompass a study of Native American history. Now, my research had not been on the Aztecs. However, during all those same 20 years, I had been teaching the Lenape. And for that reason, had been reading as many primary sources as I could, because I would use them in my classroom work. So I had a sense of where to begin. Documenting the ways in which Rutgers excluded Native American peoples was relatively easy. That is research that you do in Western records. Okay? What I struggled more with, of course, was documented the ways in which Lenape culture suffered. And this gets to what Jean Soderlund was just speaking to us about. That is, most of what is known about ancient, or shall we say early Lenape history, from that, or what we might call the colonial era and even before. Okay? Most of that work is done by archaeologists studying the material artifacts, the material remains of the Lenape people's lives. And it is very valuable work. And it teaches us a great deal about daily life, sustenance, forms of making a living, ways of making a living. But it can't teach us what people were saying to their children, the jokes they were telling, the ways that they were praying, the stories that they told. Okay? So as I had been experiencing for all those years of teaching, then I began to experience as a writer the great pain and frustration of trying to figure out how to approach this in my work and in what would be written under the auspices of Rutgers University. And eventually I ended up following the trail of some of the anthropologists who appeared on the scene, as I'm sure you know, many of you know, in the early 20th century. Now, the Lenape had been pushed out of New Jersey long before that, but many of these sort of new anthropologists were very interested in East Coast and particularly Algonquian speaking, it's a language family, Algonquian speaking Native Americans. So I pursued one whose writings were known to be in the Smithsonian. His name was Mark Harrington. And since you are here because you're interested in New Jersey history, some of you may actually know some of his work. He wrote a very famous book for children, Dickon Among the Lenape. And it was because of that book, in fact, that I first ended up following him before I followed other anthropologists, okay, whom I thought might have studied the Lenape. And indeed, his papers in the Smithsonian indicate that he had indeed done a great deal of work. This photograph of him here shows him in Puerto Rico, where he was looking for traces of indigenous culture among the mestizo population. As you can probably glean just from this photo, he's a well-meaning guy. He was a well-meaning guy, but he was also, as you would imagine, an early 20th century imperialist in many ways. Okay? So I'm not here to idolize Mark Harrington, okay? But I am here to say that the papers he ended up leaving us and that are now deposited in the Smithsonian have turned out to be very valuable to Lenape history and the study of Lenape culture, I guess I should say. So Harrington, went out to Bartlesville, Oklahoma in the early 1900s. Now, many of you probably know, Oklahoma had been, until 1907, Indian territory. It was the place where so many treaties with Native American peoples would push people further west, and Oklahoma ended up being the place that received many of these groups towards the end when so much other territory had already been made officially into states. Okay. Well, in 1907, the US government reneged on many of those remaining agreements and turned Indian Territory into the state of Oklahoma. Okay. But there were still many Native American groups and tribes there, of course, and they continued to be there. They were not ejected in 1907. Okay. So just to make sure we're all clear on this, this is a sort of a crucial link right here. Some of you may know it well, but others may not. Okay. Harrington went to Bartlesville, Oklahoma, not because Indian Territory is being turned into Oklahoma, but because he wanted to meet there the Lenape people whom he knew had settled in that area. Okay. Now, why were they way out there? Okay, well, as you have just heard from Professor Soderlund, from Jean Soderlund, okay, there had long, throughout the colonial era, been pressure pushing them gradually out of New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. And much of the material that she went over with us, the observations of the Swedes and then of the English Presbyterians comes from, well, all of the material comes from that period and that place. Okay. By the time of the American Revolution, there were still some Lenape left in Pennsylvania, but by then many of them had been pushed further into Ohio. Okay. After the Revolution, they were pushed even further into Indiana and a few into Illinois. Okay. So roughly every generation, one could argue, they'd been pushed further west. Remember, this had started, the big push outward had started after the English had come in, right, in the 1660s. So through the late 1600s, early 1700s, and then late 1700s, they're pushed this far. Okay. By the early 1800s, okay, even in Indiana and Illinois, where they had thought they could stay, okay, there was so much pressure from settlers, both on the Indians and on the US government to push them further, that another treaty was signed, this time pushing the main body. Some groups went elsewhere, but this red line follows what's called the main body, or the majority of the Lenape people. Okay. They were sent to the eastern part of Missouri, okay, where they ended up having a dreadful time. Disease struck them. There were wars with other Native American groups. Okay. So they ended up going to Kansas, okay, where they stayed from, say, the 1820s to the 1860s. But after the Civil War, and they were pulled into the Civil War. Remember Bleeding Kansas? Does that ring a bell from your studies of the Civil War? After their time in Kansas and the experience of the Civil War, they were offered, shall we say, I'm putting that euphemistically, the chance to move to Indian Territory further south, okay? And they went. Now, during the course of these repeated removals, okay, one could even say forced exodus, the name gradually changed. Okay? They became known simply as the Delaware from the time that they had lived on the Delaware River, and only occasionally as the Lenape, although in their own language, the word for the nation is the Lenape. Okay? So again, by the 1860s, the late 1860s, they had been pushed into Indian Territory, the northeastern quadrant of Oklahoma near Bartlesville. And so that is why Harrington went to Bartlesville, Oklahoma, to get to know the Lenape or Delaware people. Okay. One of the people he got to know best of all was Charles Elkaire, seen here with his grandson. Okay. Charles Elkaire had been born about 1860, maybe even a little earlier, in Kansas. His father, Mosihokund, literally the hair of an elk, okay, he had been born. Charles was born when that man was an older father, shall we say. So he had been born in the early 18 teens, right before his people were pushed out of Indiana. Okay. So Charles, again, this is someone who grew up speaking only Delaware, only Lenape. He was raised in Kansas by a father who had come from what they thought of as the East Coast, that is from Ohio Territory, it was just called, from Indiana. So in 2 generations, they had moved from their sort of eastern woodlands lifestyle and culture to life in Oklahoma. And this man, Charles Elkaire, turned out to have an extraordinary memory for the stories. He had been preaching in traditional Lenape church worship, ceremonial worship for decades. He had been remembering and telling the stories, and he shared many of them with Harrington. Oops, sorry, on my screen, this isn't showing. Hopefully on yours it is. Okay, this is his wife, Susan Half Moon, showing what she wore when they went to celebrate their religious ceremony called the Big House Ceremony. And, oops. Here is their, actually not their son, his son, Charles Elkaire's son by a prior marriage, Jesse Elkaire, when he was an adult. He too has now passed away. Okay? But here's Jesse Elkaire. And there were other children. That is, Charles and Susie Elkaire had together 2 daughters, one of whom also had children. So there are plenty of other descendants. In any event, with the help of Charles Elkaire and his wife and his children, and with the help of other Lenape or Delaware people who were living in the Bartlesville area at the time, most especially Julian Fouts, but there were others as well. With all of their help, Mark Harrington was able to write down all sorts of stories. And then something even more wonderful happened. They decided amongst themselves, that is the Lenape did, to write down their stories and mail them to Harrington. Here is a letter dated March 20th, 1909. It says, "Dear Mr. Harrington, my dear friend, I thought I would send you a few lines of this story. My boy got back from school and I told him to put it down, and then the rest you can't see it." This is from Julius Fouts, and his, quote, boy is his stepson, Willie. So we have many stories that he, Julius Fouts, dictated to his stepson, Willie, when he was home on vacation from one of the dreaded boarding schools. Okay? And then we have a few that Charles Elkaire's daughters wrote down too. And we even have 1, maybe 2, I'm still studying the handwriting, that Julian Fouts wrote himself. And it was hard for him because he was a fluent Lenape speaker and he was writing this down in English using someone else's alphabet, but he did it, okay? At least in one case, maybe in another. So what I want to do with the rest of my time, there isn't a huge amount of it, but with the little bit of time we have left, is stop sharing the screen, okay? And read just one of the shortest stories that is very revealing of some of the same ideas that Jean Soderlund was just talking about. I wish to underscore this. As I go through the stories, I have been stunned at the extent to which they match brief summaries of stories that Moravian and Presbyterian missionaries back in the 18th century and early 19th century have given us. So that, in other words, what the stories that the Lenape were telling in the 16 and 1700s track quite closely to the stories they were still telling in the early 1900s. Remember, they had left the East Coast, left the Ohio Territory, if we're even going to call that the East Coast, over 100 years earlier. So over 100 years of forced migration. They had not only kept their language alive and their tribal structure alive, but were even continuing to sort of creatively and imaginatively tell some of the same stories about the same ideas. These were people who by now had been farming for generations, but they continued to tell stories based on a hunting religion, for instance. So it's very compelling. They were clearly making an extraordinary effort to keep their philosophy, their religion, their culture alive. So enough of that. I'm just going to read in the last few minutes one of the things that Julian Fouts dictated to Harrington that is very much about the evil that was brought by the white people. Okay? In the early life of the Delaware Indians came the origination of white men. When the white man was first created, it is said that there was no other nation then on earth existing except the Indians. And remember, his word for Indians in Delaware or in Lenape would have been the Lenape, the people. Okay? They were visited by a man of an unknown nation, meaning an unknown tribe. Okay? This stranger then began to teach the Indians a religious training, telling them how they should live. And this stranger resembled these Indians themselves in color, perhaps, and in disposition. The stranger departed from the Indians, going toward a nearby stream. When he reached the stream, it was flowing along nicely. In the stream, he even seen remember, this is a rural Oklahoma guy who was raised speaking another language and is now speaking English. So you're going to get rural grammatical forms. He even seen a great heaps of foam accumulated on the water, took notice of the large heaps of foam. He studied over the situation. This man was sent by God to the Indians to teach them the way to live. After meditating for a time, he decided that he could create man himself out of a heap of foam. He gathered some of the foam and created man in his own image. So this man has read the Bible too, or heard it. At the finish of his creation of this being, the being looked better in every way, seemed to be fairer in color, and there were men than other men of this class, of this image. Okay? And they were strong in physique and increased fast. When there came to be many of them, he had no further influence over them. They would not hive to the teachings of their creator. He could not determine how he could induce them to observe his commands. They became boisterous and mean, very unruly. He could not control them. He then decided to go back to God. And when he had journeyed until near to his destination, he beheld there was a great canyon before him. And there, fortunately, he met his brother. He told his brother that his nation of people had been unruly and disobedient to him. I taught them the way to live, but they would not hive to my commands, he said to his brother. They even killed me. The brother then asked him if he would give his people over to him. If you give them to me, I shall teach them the way of loving and teach them every mechanical trade and benefit to mankind and make them a wise nation and all things for the future use henceforth. The brother consented to give these people to his brother for him to teach and command them to the best of his ability and his power. The other brother, then took charge of these people, and he taught them all useful trades and industry. And then that people who are the pale faces began to learn fast by practice. The better means of progress and success followed, and life and happiness was soon established among them. And this man also taught them how to scheme, and that he could mislead his own brother to his satisfaction. The creator of these people soon discovered that his brother was much wiser than himself. And he after observed that his brother had been condemned by God because he was selfish and disobedient to God himself, false to him. It was for this reason that he had met his brother to pretend to offer his service to take command of the people that he had created. Unto this day, we find that that same evil exists greater than righteousness throughout the entire world. We find that evil is all the more strong now in every respect. The condemned man meaning the condemned brother, must have been Satan, who was so false to God he could no further abide in the home of good or righteous men. And he was sent out of the home of God unto earth, where he went to his brother at that gorge in that canyon. And this story came down from our forefathers, handed down from my father until now it is with us this present day. And that is why I can tell this story to you, as I hereby do. Very truly yours, Julius Fouts. Clearly, this is a story that has had other influences, including the influence of Christianity, but the story that came down from the colonial era of the anger against these people who claim to be Christians, claim to be doing what's right, but are really traitors to God, seems to me to speak very strongly. In other stories, they actually still use the words colonists. They were still in the early 1900s, very much aware of what had been talked about around campfires in the late 17 and early 1800s. It's quite striking. With there, I will leave it and turn things over to Nicky Michael, who will bring us into the present day. Okay.
Right. Umosi hamohech, Talensi o Patayachwe, Lenape ni, Niguis Bekinun Otahkoken Ila Okshakahane. So I just introduced myself in my Lenape language, and I told you my name and that I'm a mother. And to most of our Lenape people, that is one of the most sacred kind of places you can be, or people you can be as a mother. And then of course, on top of that would be the matriarchs, the grandmothers. So that's the perspective I'm going to come to you today with, to explain a little bit about what our current lifestyle is like here in Oklahoma. I am a tribal council member of the Delaware tribe, and I am one of the few partial speakers of our language. There's nobody today who grew up speaking Lenape as their first language. We're all in a particular time when we're going from that era of those who knew and grew up with our culture and language to those who are no longer able to just, snap and go, yeah, we know that. Okay, so if we look back, and I want to explain a little bit about how I came to learn Lenape to the extent that I do. And I'm going to show you some slides of current day Lenape, or at least the ones that might show the kind of context and the lifestyles and the livelihoods that we now participate in. We do still tell our stories. Typically, our stories are in the winter, or told in the winter. We don't want to tell them off season because then something bad might happen. But the stories are usually kind of separated into several different categories. There would be the creation stories, the one where we are born off the turtle's back, and that's how we came to be on Turtle Island. And just to translate, that would be the North American continent. The other stories might be something about a character. One of the kids' favorite stories, the Mimansak favorite stories, is those about the dogs who like to snip each other's behinds. Kids get a kick out of that one all the time. It just gives an explanation of why dogs do certain things. And dogs are very important to Lenape people. They protected us, they helped us. Even if an owner, and I say that loosely, we're more friends with dogs, other creations, all of our relations. So when I say that owner of that particular dog, if they died, then that dog would go with them to the other world. So, and the other one would be morals. Stories are meant to teach us how we're supposed to act, how to respect our relatives, how to be a good relative. And ultimately, in any Indigenous society, whether it's Lenape or an Indigenous society, say the Samis in Sweden, it's going to be about your relations first. Your family is always there at the core, and you surround yourself with them, but you also make sure that you give according to what their needs are. Okay, so the predecessors, Camilla and Jean Soderlund, have explained how we got to Oklahoma, but there's a few things I want to kind of show you that still impact us from those transitions to Oklahoma. So let me get the slideshow up. And so these are the two tribes in Oklahoma, the Lenapes that are federally recognized, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, and then the Delaware Nation. There's also a Muncie band, which is up in Wisconsin. They're the Stockbridge Muncie. We all communicate with each other. We all work together, especially when it comes to our NAGPRA issues and cultural revitalization. Our tribe, the Delaware that are in Eastern Oklahoma, we're the main body. And they call us the main body because we brought our Hingwickown, our big house church, with us all across the country, from those early removals up into New York, then Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, and into Kansas. We brought our big house, our church, with us, and we kept observing that every year. We also had what was called the doll dance, and that was another sacred ceremony that we brought with us. And the Delaware Nation kind of lost that along the way. So we would visit each other, especially from Kansas to Texas. And the Texas Lenape would come up to Kansas and partake in those events, those religious ceremonies. And then you'll see on the title, it says Lenape Women, and that's how you would say Lenape Women, Lenape Hue. Okay, now if I could get this to move, there we go. So I'm just telling you right here, I'm just giving you my introduction. I'm a professor at Bacone College, and I still teach at Bemidji State University. I teach Indigenous studies. I like the idea of American Indian studies and Native American studies, but I think that we're moving towards a new direction of recognizing all of our tribes in the relation to the rest of the world that have Indigenous populations that were also colonized. All right, so in 1492, Lenape women would be caretaking of the home, caretaking of the gardens, caretaking of her family and the children, and then doing the cooking. You can see this is no different from today. This is Mary Waters, and she's one of the elders I interviewed in the early 1990s, and she was a very well-loved elder before she passed away, and she comes from the Elkaire family. So she does have a long direct descendancy into some of those important positions that most of you were talking about earlier. And here she's just, taking care of her family. She's making some fry bread, and we have like a fry bread contest during powwow. So I think that was the year she won, but she won a lot of years. The Treaty of Fort Pitt is one of the first treaties that we were supposed to have a couple of, let's say, responsibilities, but they never came to fruition. The United States promised the Delawares to be the first state, and Indian state, with a representative in Congress. And the state itself was just supposed to be ours, and we were going to be at the head of it. That did not occur. Instead, my people were removed repeatedly into Indian territory by way of Kansas, and then we were plopped on top of the Cherokee Nation. The Delaware Nation, or the absentees, they split off with us in Arkansas, and they went down to Texas. And the Texas and Kansas, Delaware would interchange, but and they would go back and forth, but for the most part, the main body was considered the one in Kansas. All right, so along the way, we've also talked about the destruction of our people and our cultures. One of them was infesting the blankets with smallpox. And there's a person, William Trent, who was at Fort Pitt, who recognized what had happened and actually wrote about it. So I've also had historians confront me on this and say that never happened. And we actually do have that evidence showing that it was indeed true that they purposely used those smallpox blankets to infest our people. And so that was a long stretch of trying to survive that kind of germ warfare, but there's also the physical warfare and the constant moving. We had to adjust going from fishing and hunting in a different climate each time. So the first one's like the ocean, right? Where we're fishing and hunting, but then we're moved inward and we're starting to have to just rely on hunting. By the time we get to Kansas, we're learning how to be a plains tribe and also bison and compete with those same plains tribes that are already there. And do you think they wanted us there? Because they didn't. We ended up having to fight pretty hard for the places that we had. All right, so this slide right here just gives you a different, a little bit of a perspective. I focus on women because that's what I am, a woman, and we're a matriarchal society. And most of the interviews I have done are with the women. Not that women are all, that men are their complements, and yes, they have their roles, and we'll talk about that more later. But the food allocation systems, the economic systems, the home was hers, the gardens were hers, the fishing, everything that he brought back would be doled out by the women, usually the matriarchs and the moms. This is what our dress would look like. It's not something that most people see as like glamorous. It's just, your simple skirt and then your top. And that was our everyday clothing. Today, you see a few women still wear a style like that. Most of us have adopted the ribbon work patterns, the full blouses, and the leggings and moccasins. We practiced our spirituality and wearing our traditional clothes pretty much all the way up to 1920. And in the 1920s, things went a little bit south when we had to deal with the loss of deer. They overhunted the deer population, so we can no longer sustain ourselves by hunting the things that weren't available to us. And in not being able to hunt deer, then we couldn't have our Hingwikan, the traditional religion. All right, so this is what the Hingwikan looked like. That was our big house church. And this is the Missing right here. And he's the keeper of the game animal. And the left side would have been black and stood for death. He represented men. And then the women are life, and the color would be red. Incidentally, this big house ceremony, when it stopped in the 1920s, about 20 years later, it was still standing. And what happened to it is that a group of Boy Scouts went in and pretty much took all the insides out, the big poles. Every once in a while, we'll find pieces of it in different museums. And hopefully one day we'll have it all back together in our own museum in one place. So you've heard from Dr. Soderlund about the resistance of Christianity. That is a big issue still today amongst our people. We still have some splits between those Christians and then the tribal peoples that are more traditional, and still we don't follow the Hingwikan as much as we do traditional ways or spirituality. But it mostly has to do with the massacre at Agnutenhutton, when there were hundreds of our people just slaughtered, and they had accepted Christianity. So we saw what would happen even if we do accept Christianity. We were still Indian, so that's going to be at the core, that nothing we were going to do was ever going to be able to be enough. So here's what another map shows the different migration routes. And then this is a picture of what we would do on the inside of the Hingwikan. This is when the stories would be told. This is when the dances would be danced. This one looks like a bean dance. And you see the women on the outside. You would, if you knew these folks personally, you would say that this is one particular clan. It's probably the turtle. And then you'd come over here and, oh, these are the wolves. So that they're all sitting in different places. And then these folks in the middle would be the ones doing either the dances or talking about their visions. In Oklahoma, things were pretty rough, especially during those first few years trying to fight out for territory with the Cherokee Nation. Again, we were plopped on top of their nation. They didn't want us and we didn't want to move, but we really didn't have a choice. Once we got here, then we were exploited, our children were exploited. It was kind of in that era of allotment when oil and gas were found. And so one thing that I think most people are really shocked to hear about is that Phillips Petroleum was founded off of a Delaware Indian girl's land. Her name was Anna Anderson. She was considered a full-blood Delaware. And in that regard, she had to have a court-appointed guardian, because back in that day, if you were full blood, then they would consider you incompetent. And so her guardian was Frank Phillips. And so the Nellie Johnstone was the very first well found in Oklahoma, and it was on her land. So she got royalties in her lifetime, but nothing nearly enough to sustain generations to come. Her son received some royalties, but it stopped with her son. So you know what, Phillips Petroleum is like one of the biggest oil and gas producing corporations in the world, and the Delawares have never seen any part of it. So here are a couple of descendants of those folks that were talked about earlier, of the Elkaires. This is a really cute pair, and they are Sally and Rosa Elkaire. So you can see that in this era, this is like the 1940s, they're starting to, adopt Western type clothing, but they would still wear it in ceremonial events. Here's some more members of our families. This is the Andersons, and they're right in front of the big house right here. Again, it hadn't been going on for a while, but it was still there at that point. Here's the Folly family. Fred Folly was their kind of a common denominator, common ancestor, but he also came from the Elkaires. So they're a fun group. You can see this bicycle guy. And then we have our Lenape warriors, both women and men, but I'm featuring the women because we're talking about not just those who went into war, we're talking about those who were at Standing Rock not too long ago in 2015 and 16. There are Delaware War Mothers who recognize the military, and you see their images right here. Most of them are some of the elder women. And then you can see some common other dresses as well. So this is not traditional Lenape, but these are Lenape people. So they can choose either to go buckskin or they could wear traditional Delaware clothes. This is a modern day Delaware woman. Her name's Red Day. And this is one of ours back at the turn of the century. And it just struck me as how close they're holding the babies the same way. And she's getting ready for one of our dances, the turtles and shaking shells. That is part of our stomp dance tradition. So I wanted to get a picture of that in here. Women wear the turtles, men do the singing and the ceremonial songs. This is from the 1970s, it's the bean dance, and it's called Klingekown. Excuse me, yeah. And basically what they're doing is holding hands, and there's a leader kind of circling around, and they're copying the bean vine, which is growing up and around the other two sisters, right? You have the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So this bean vine is circling around, going in and out, and they're all singing the songs. There's 9 different songs to the bean dance. Okay, this is Lucy Parks Blaylock and Nora Thompson Dean. So if you know much about our Lenape people, you'll know that Lucy and Nora are our last fluent speakers. They were alive, she was alive till the 1980s, and Lucy passed away in 2000 at 90 years old. What I do know of Lenape, I learned from speaking with Lucy, and she was sent to boarding school, Chilocco, and I asked her why she wouldn't give up her language, and she just said, well, because she was kind of stubborn like most Delawares, and she said, well, I just wouldn't let them take my language away. And from there, I knew that she was a really strong lady, because to try to keep speaking your language as a baby, a 4 or 5, 6 or 7 year old in any of those boarding schools was to really risk a lot of pain. and she wasn't going to let them do that to her. Here's a couple more pictures of Nora and her niece. And then we have another one over here of one of her sisters. And I love this picture because it shows such strength of our women. Here are some of the folks who were working on our language at the time Lucy was still alive, and we're still using her work. This is Jim Rementer. He was instrumental in helping us develop the Lenape Talking Dictionary. The Lenape Talking Dictionary has some of the stories in there. It also has translations. It's all recorded of elders who spoke our language first, and then he translates it to English. There's prayers in there. So we're working on revitalization efforts, but it is also a very long process, and we're hoping to speed it up now that we've got some more support in doing so. Lucy has a daughter that is an artist, and she's nationally renowned. You can see her work right here, just beautiful. So that's mom Lucy, and this is daughter Ruthie. And then there's another common denominator of what most Delaware women do. And this is Patsy Martin. This is our traditional Lenape clothing, if it would be cloth. And you can see the Emerita collar right here. You can see the ruffles and the skirt. Typically, we'd also have an apron on. And this would be our everyday wear. So that we call the day dress. But then if we wanted to dress up, then we might wear that same shirt, but we'd have the leggings and the moccasins and some ribbon work along the side of our wraparound skirt. A little bit about the Delaware Nation, our sister tribe. So this is a picture of Deborah Dotson, who was the first female elected to their presidency, and that's her. So that's a pretty significant achievement. And we had our first female chief back in, let's see, it was 2015, 14, 15. Yeah, she stayed in and she did really well, but then, you know, elections, things can turn over pretty quickly. So with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions or thoughts. You can do the stop share.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate all of you sharing. I would love to have all the speakers come back on camera so that we can get started with Q&A. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's see. We do have first questions. This is for all of the panelists. Where do you see the greatest opportunities for new research and scholarship in Indigenous history, particularly as it relates to Lenape history?
Nicky, do you want to take that first, or shall I? Or I don't know. Actually, Jean, if you're going to talk about the colonial sources, you should. I don't know. Why don't we each give our instinctive answer? It will be different in each case.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Well, what I would say is the more modern period is where more focus should be placed at this point. I really appreciated both Camille and Nicky's presentations, and I really think that scholars should focus, you know, work with you and focus on that era.
Jean, it's wonderful that you say that. And I have come to believe that too. I mean, as you know, I'm a colonialist, and it was little, you know, step by step and little by little that I ended up in 20th century Oklahoma. And I too have felt, as you know, it's of course it's imperative, important. You know, it's imperative from the living peoples that culture be studied. But even if, and the question was about history, even if we're looking at history, and I think finding whatever texts we can that do survive, whether it's interviews or these stories that need to be researched more, that if we could know more about that, it will also teach us more about the present day peoples. That is because so much of these texts that do survive reflect the past, but tie us to the present, which is indeed, I think you would agree, Nicky, central to the core of the identity, that it is an ongoing chain from past to future. I don't know. But what would you say? You'd probably say the language, right? The first order of business, save the language. Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
definitely. The language is, everything is coded in the language. Right? If we and you don't even have to know it, but be able to understand what the structure is, right? So we're a nature-based language. We're not thinking in terms of an automobile or a plane flying over. Our language is steeped in nature. You know, what are our medicines and our foods, and then how our bodies react to that. And so there's so much more to language than when you just say, oh yeah, for the sake of our kids, and that would be in and of itself enough, but there's more, right? There's those layers that go into it, and if we don't have that as the core base to grow from, it can't be anything else. You can't start over here and then go to the language and then go, oh yeah, okay, this bridges it and it's backwards. It's the core. So it has to start with the language, and it also has to include our voices. I think that's another thing that the academy has missed in the last 100 years, is that when you're talking about us, but not with us, right? That inclusion has to be there. And we have so many younger generations and so many young voices that do want to be a part of this and want to be a part of that conversation that reclaims our history and reclaims our identity as Lenape. And we want to institute those practices that we couldn't do before. I mean, it was up till 1970 that we weren't able to practice our religion. I mean, that's the bottom line right here. Like, it was illegal. Absolutely. Our people would risk jail time if we had done any of our ceremonies. You know, and even today, if we were to do something like send our boys out on a vision quest, that would be 3 or 4 days out by themselves without food or water. 14, 15-year-olds, what do you think that would? Yeah, that would indicate something that, yeah. So and now that's like a dream come true for most of our people, would be able to exercise those kind of rights that we should have, but know that we can't do.
You know, you just referenced something that comes up in the stories and in the comments that Charles Elkaire and Julian Fouts both make in the early 1900s. That is, they had, as you know, but the audience doesn't know, well, most doesn't, they had been to a Christian school for a few years each. So they had each been exposed to missionary teachings, although Charlie Elkaire loved to say it didn't stick, I didn't learn anything. But one of the things they said was that the missionaries had sort of impressed upon them that these vision quests were actually abusive. They used the word abuse. I guess that was abuse, they would say, because, you know, the missionaries had told them it was abusive to have the children go out alone into the woods. Okay, and they'd say, so I guess it was abusive. Like, I mean, they didn't want to argue, I suppose, in front of Harrington with this past teacher. But then they'd say, but we did bring home the visions, which made it possible to talk to God and to have the Shingle King, to have the big house religion. So they had sort of internalized it and yet not. That there was some struggle there. They brought it up, they alluded to it, but then they came down on the side that, well, at least we had the visions. And the problem, of course, by about 1910 was that there were no longer boys going out to have the visions, just as you were saying. So they couldn't carry on because the religious ceremony, as you explained, was to tell the stories of the visitations by the gods together in the group. And you can't tell those stories if you haven't had those experiences. So, so everything that you're saying, what they were concerned about even 100 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Thank you so much for that, all of you. Dr. Nicky Michael, we have a question. Where do we find, in fact, there's actually a few questions about education around young children, particularly about the current Lenape people. Many learn, you know, about their history in school, but then to learn about the future and the present. Would love to hear from all of you.
Ooh, Well, I can say for teacher training, we're starting to work with the city of New York, and that's been a huge achievement, honestly. And you would think it would have been second nature that people would call us and say, hey, you guys want to be a part of whatever our teaching, or make the Algonquin and the Lenape side of the story, whereas the Dutch have theirs all already ingrained. So, wouldn't it be appropriate to get those Delaware stories out there? I mean, so I think there's an awakening starting to happen. It's just coming to light. As far as like our resources, we have what's called the Lenape OC program, and we teach our young children. Often they're multi-tribal, not just Lenape, but we focus on Lenape culture, and we teach them their dances and how to sing, and maybe some basic language games. And we try to make it fun and engaging for them, so they don't think of our language as like, sometimes you can get kind of harsh and lamatakwi, sit down, right? And that's kind of a more of a harsh way that children learn. But if we make it fun and engaging and exciting, then that's the kind of memories they have of it. So we want to continue to follow those lines of thinking as we're developing resources for kids. But as yet, we fought probably a good 75 years with the Cherokee Nation in Supreme Court almost the Supreme Court. In a couple of cases did go to the Supreme Court, but whether we are federally recognized or not, or recognized under the Cherokees, and we kept losing. And so at whatever point it was, we decided we're no longer going to go the court route, which we'd already spent millions and millions of dollars that we didn't have on, and all our resources were going towards that. At that same kind of trajectory, we're losing those elders that knew those stories, that knew our ways of being before colonization. So that's all to say, we really haven't had the time or energy to focus on children's programs or books, though we would like to.
Thank you again. We have one more sort of a follow-up question for that. Would you be able to say more about how younger people in your community are finding their identity? Perhaps sharing who they are reading, watching, listening to, and learning from.
Well, we're a really tight community, small in Bartlesville, although we have almost 14,000 members now. We are all over the world, not just the United States, but those that are local tend to have more access to it, of course. And so before COVID, we always got together at least once a week, if not more, to have dinner, and we engage in our songs, we do the bean dances. Sometimes it would be more adult focused where they would be doing the program, and like, if they were working on moccasin making, something a little bit more technical, or if it's more fun and engaging for the kids, then that kind of programming would take place for them. And so that once a week consistency is a really critical component to that. And then everybody knows each other, and we have to leave the politics at the door. So say, for instance, we have a fight the night before at tribal council, and they can get pretty rough. Sometimes chairs can be thrown. Not so much recently, but we've seen it. And so that next day, if you're still angry from that, you just stay out, right? You can't bring those politics in and try to retain culture, and especially when you're around the kids. So we have to leave those politics at the door, and we might have to hold hands during the bean dance with somebody the night before that we were just fighting with. That's what tribalism is. Like, that is the connecting binds that, and then when you're doing that, your energy's flowing through each other, and you're thanking the life forces that have allowed you to be there. And yeah, this is a beautiful thing. We love doing it. But COVID has we've lost a lot of elders through COVID, and it's really hampered our ability to get together and enjoy those events. And so now we're trying to figure out alternative ways of reaching out to our kids, because even 2 years from a 7 to a 9-year-old is a big deal, right? Those are some formative times that you don't want to miss.
So Nicky, everything you've said has just been so wonderful. I think it's so helpful. One thing you just said struck me so much, something that I haven't shown you yet, because I only just finished transcribing it. One of the things that I think Julius Fouts wrote himself. So that's why I had put it off, because the handwriting was tough, right? Anyway, he said, he's talking about the big house. He was very worried that it was going to get closed down, which it ultimately did, was put away because they didn't have enough vision, young men with visions anymore. But in any event, he said there exactly what you're saying, that when you come together as a tribe to do the shingwecking, you leave the arguments outside. And if you don't, you will be removed. They will decide, right, who is causing, bringing this fight into the community, right? I know you didn't read this because I haven't shown it to you yet, right? It's stunning to me, both, I've seen it now in the papers, finding things in the early 1900s that someone else mentioned in the 1800s or the 1700s, but today too, you've said a couple things that sound like they're coming, straight out of the mouths of these people, and in this case, a paper you haven't read. So it shows, despite the difficulties, the extraordinary extent to which this by now relatively small and beleaguered people have managed to keep, tell those stories, pass on those ways, explain how it should be done to the next one, and not let it, not let it shrivel and die. It's quite extraordinary, right?
Thank you all. And we have one final question. Is there anything in addition to monetary donations that we can do to support the language project?
Well, I guess we three, or especially we two, Nicky and I should be figuring that out, shouldn't we? Right? These stories that we're going to publish soon, that thanks to Peter Mickulas and the press, some of them are in print already, thanks to John Bierhorst, who published some of them years ago, but others are not. And there's certainly no place where everything that the Elkaires and Fouts said at one time has been pulled together. So I suppose one thing we could think about doing is trying to start up some sort of a collective that academics would participate in that would work on translating them into Delaware. Now, those that were worked on before by John Bierhorst, some of them were spoken in Delaware. Thank you, Peter. He's showing John Bierhorst's book. And some of those stories were told or read by Nora Dean Townsend, whose photo you all saw, thanks to Nicky. So some of those stories could then be published, or a version of them, Nora's version of them, could be published in Lenape. And maybe a collective could work on trying to translate more of them. But this would be a project for another year. First, Nicky and I have to finish the book of the stories in English, right? But that's it. Whoever made that comment, I hope you write to us later, because that's a wonderful thing to keep in mind, that there might be more general interest beyond the two of us in trying to bring this scholarship to make it useful to the language revitalization project.
If I also may add a little bit, it may be indirect, but the land back movement is really important. Again, we're a land-based, naturally based language. To be in an era where everything is technologically driven kind of changes the face of what we can teach and how we can teach it. Some things may be better, like having those apps, right? Kids can learn with those apps and text each other in apps. So that would be kind of another avenue if people had resources and connections that we could go for, then that would be awesome. But being a part of a landscape, or being able to take the kids anywhere where they could stay for, a week camp, and we do nothing but immersion programs, would be phenomenal. And I would love to see that even 4 or 5 times a year. Things like we live by the ocean. I said that to begin with. We have one person who has brought back the wampum making, taking the wampum out of the shells and making them into the actual jewelry or shells that we used to have many people that knew how to do it. And now we had to relearn to do it, and we don't have access to those kind of things. And it's half of our language is about those fish and shells. So if we had access to those, that would be another avenue of being able to support us. but I really, the land back movement is probably the #1 way of, and I know that doesn't sound like would have been a direct, like shoe into to supporting our language, but ultimately, if you don't have your early or even transitional areas where our language evolved in each of those places, then, that part of the language just stays in a book.
Absolutely. I will ask actually one final question. We had a question for Jean. George Fox traveled across New Jersey and had a conversation with Lenape and was impressed with them. Does your book deal with his interactions as well? Just a question about, I guess, if George Fox and his travels are mentioned in your book specifically.
Yes, they are. And they're also they're mentioned in both books, Lenape Country and also the new book, Separate Paths. So yes, it's an interesting encounter, and he traveled across New Jersey in 1672, gave his account of meeting with a number of Lenape leaders and staying in at least one town. And he moved from Salem, what is now Salem County, across to Middletown, then to New York and into New England, and then came back through what we would call across Route 1 now, from Manhattan to Burlington, that area. And he had heard the story of the 2 Dutch men who had been killed by the Napis the previous year. But he took back the story to England that the Lenapes were friendly, though not particularly interested in Quakerism. And I think that he spread the news to other Quakers that they should think about colonizing the area. So, yes.
Thank you so much for your insight. And, we can open the floor for any final remarks or thoughts from any of the panelists, or Peter, obviously, if you would like to join in as well. I know there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, but we really appreciate all the interactivity of this session, and obviously all of you sharing your expertise and lived experiences.
I don't have anything substantive to add to what our panelists said. I would just encourage anyone who's interested in the books that we've mentioned, the books that are forthcoming. You can contact me. You can look at the Rutgers Press website. If you have projects or ideas, please also feel free to contact me about that. I welcome your input. Thanks. Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you, especially Nicky, for joining us from Oklahoma. Right.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lucky.
Great to meet you.
You too.
Wanishi, thank you. Right. Okay.